Hello, how you doing? I'm Latif Tarik, Assistant Professor of History at Elizabeth City State University and the History Program Coordinator. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey of tracing the hollow grounds of Black historical sites and cemeteries and planned communities in Tidewater. So stay with me. Now, most people are looking at the screen. They probably won't recognize these two individuals, even though they know their names. Isaiah Charles Norcom, in which I.C. Norcom High School is named after, and Ida Barber. Ida Barber is no longer here anymore in Portsmouth, Virginia. It was a housing development. However, she's one of the oldest educators in Portsmouth, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her a little later. So, how did we get to Virginia? We got to Virginia because 20 so-odd Negroes was captured on a ship and brought into Point Comfort, Hampton, which is today Fort Monroe. So if you look at this sign where it says First Africans in Virginia, this is basically where the history of African Americans start in the state of Virginia. So looking at this, the first documented Africans in Virginia arrived in 1619. Most of you all have probably already learned that in your social studies class. So looking at the geographies of Virginia, basically what we're going to be talking about is Tidewater. But more specifically, we're going to be talking about Norfolk and Portsmouth. What is the history of African Americans in Norfolk and Portsmouth? So if you look at this slide here, the local history in Tidewater from 1877 to the 21st century is basically where I'm going to start. That is the period in terms of the end of slavery and the period that we call Reconstruction. We're going to look at Black settlements, the post-Civil War Black communities, Black in education, Black historical societies of Tidewater, and I'll briefly show you some of the slides of Nat Turner and the Nat Turner Trail. The picture that you're actually looking at here is actually my great-great-grandfather, who was born in Franklin, Virginia in 1877 during that time period. So, if you think about who we are as African Americans in Virginia, we actually go all the way back to the colonial times. All right, and in this book here, Reading in Black and White in the Lower Tidewater, is a book that I acquired years ago in the Portsmouth Library, looking at some of the topics in which Black people are recorded in history. The manumitted free African Americans, the librarian question. We'll talk about Edwin Blyden a little later. A lot of you all are very familiar with the Blyden Library on East Princess Anne Road, which is named after him. The Virginia Colonization Society, a little bit about Gabriel Prosser and Nat Turner and the rest of Tidewater. All right, so one of the things that I actually do, I actually go around Tidewater and take pictures of some of the historical sites and events that have taken place. So Dr. E. Curtis Alexander, which is a local historian and the curator of the Bells Mill Historical Society, had a program almost maybe about 10 years ago now. In the Bells Mill Historical Research Society, one of the things that they did, they wanted to honor the African American men who fought in the Civil War. So that's why you see the sign over there to say the Unknown and Known Afro-Union Civil War Soldiers Memorial. And this tree is a tree that these men planted, which is called the Freedom Tree. Bells Mill is in Chesapeake, on the backside of Deep Creek when you go down the canal. All right, so within Chesapeake, we have some very historical places such as Cuffytown. Cuffytown is one of Virginia's oldest Black settlements. Cuffytown is also known for having over 200 current living descendants. The same thing with the Bells Mill community. The United States Colored Troops, which we will talk about later. The African American soldiers and their families who helped to emancipate Black people from enslavement. Over 180,000 African American men fought for the United States Colored Troops, and residents of Virginia, those who were free and enslaved, fought in some of the battles that was located right here in Virginia. So we have Wilson Wharf, we have the Battle of Suffolk, the Battle of Petersburg, and New Market Heights. African American soldiers was directly responsible for helping to free many of the enslaved that was located right here in Virginia during the Civil War. So I'm going to go to some of the local history. A lot of people walk past some of the most common sites here in Tidewater without really knowing the history of them. So one of the pictures that I have up here is the first African-American library. This library now is located on Elm Avenue in Portsmouth, and it's actually an African-American museum. The information that I have for both Portsmouth and Virginia comes from this book, the Black American series, Portsmouth, Virginia. Norfolk also has its own book. Within both of those books, it documents some of the earliest history of African-American communities. All right, so I wonder if I go to I.C. Norcom High School right now and ask some of the students, what does the IC stands for, right? It stands for Isaiah Charles Norcom. So Isaiah Charles Norcom was a member of the True Reformers. He was sent to Portsmouth, Virginia to help to start public education in Portsmouth. He was sent here by the George Peabody Foundation, and one of the things that he was instrumental in doing is particularly starting public education, but he was also instrumental in starting the high schools. So the very first school in Portsmouth was not named I.C. Norcom. It was actually called the Chestnut School, on Chestnut Street School, I believe. And then a few years after I.C. Norcom passed away, they changed the school to I.C. Norcom High School. Throughout the history of Portsmouth, there have been 3 I.C. Norcom high schools. Most people probably would not remember the one that was downtown, but if you go through Portsmouth today along Frederick Boulevard, where the housing community Jeffrey Wilson used to be, that is where the second I.C. Norcom High School was located. And the third I.C. Norcom High School, which is the newest I.C. Norcom, is located off of London Boulevard, and on the other side is High Street in Portsmouth. So this is definitely Isaiah Charles Norcom. All right, now for years, most people never knew who Jeffrey Wilson was. Jeffrey Wilson also was a housing project that was in Portsmouth as well. And Jeffrey Wilson was a very unique man. He was a man that was born into slavery, and after slavery, he was considered to be a radical Republican. He used to write in the newspaper called the Portsmouth Star. And inside of the Portsmouth Star, he had a column called Colored Notes. So this is Jeffrey Wilson, and he lived in the black settlement of the community that was formed after the Civil War that was called Lincolnsville. Today, we commonly call it Lincoln Park, which is located right down Elm Avenue all the way down to George Washington Highway in Portsmouth. Ida Barber. Believe it or not, I actually went to her daycare because her daycare is still a Head Start center right now, I believe it is, in Portsmouth. But one of the things that Ida Barber did is that originally she founded the daycare as an orphanage for children. And then she realized that the preschool age children needed to be educated. So she actually turned their orphanage into a daycare. That is the red daycare building that you see in Lincolnville/Lincoln Park today. Now, Ida Barber, the housing development is no longer there. However, if you go right where Ida Barber was located, across the street, you would see her small statue across the street from where it's located. All right. Now, Virginia has both local history and it has national history. And black people are also a part of the local history and the national history. Nat Turner are one of those individuals who was in Southampton County, and he actually led a slave rebellion. Most people saw the movie of Nat Turner with Nate Parker. That happened in Southampton County in 1831. At that time, it was not called Southampton County. It was actually called the County of Jerusalem. So we have many historians locally who attempt and try to keep the local history alive. So one of the gentlemen right here, Khalifa Khalif, he does what you call the Nat Turner Trail. And this is the actual events of the night Nat Turner and his comrades went on the insurrection in which they went throughout the city of Jerusalem trying to free themselves from their slave masters. We have Mr. McGee, who also lived or is living in Southampton County, and he's a Nat Turner historian. So you will see a lot of his artwork on the front of book covers. One of his students, who's now retired from Elizabeth City State University, Mr. Alexis Joyner. Mr. Alexis Joyner is also a renowned artist, and he's also a Nat Turner historian. These are the art historians who try to keep our history alive in the form of art. Now, since you've had some of the history of Portsmouth, let's go to Norfolk, where most of you all are from. I actually purchased this book here so I can get specific information on African American experience in Norfolk, because the history that I know of Portsmouth is history that I really know from my grandparents, great-grandparents, great-aunts, and just living in Portsmouth and kind of learning the history in an oral way. So let me read this. Norfolk has been the center of African American life since this country's humble beginnings, when indentured African servants arrived in 1619 to the Tidewater region. Since that time, the African American population has endured the atrocities of slavery, poverty, and inequity, and has emerged through a remarkable combination of hard work, perseverance, and faith as a vibrant community and an integral component to the identity and success of Norfolk and surrounding areas. So this takes me to a very important figure, which is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington is from Virginia. He's actually would be considered now from West Virginia, because at that particular time, the county in which he was from was a part of Virginia until it became West Virginia. He actually walked from West Virginia to Hampton Institute at that time for his education. He didn't have any money. When he got there, the administrator of the school asked him what could he do. And he basically said, hey, you know, I can clean, I could do things like that. And the administrator of the school said, hey, I want you to clean this room. And he cleaned that room for the administrator, and he was so impressed when he came back that he allowed Booker T. Washington to go to school there. But before Booker T. Washington became this great leader of the late 19th and early 20th century, he was one of the founders in our country, right? He founded Tuskegee Institute. And Tuskegee down in Alabama is a historically black college and university today. He was a champion of industrial education and professional trades for African Americans. He inspired the Normal School concept. So the Normal School concept for historically black colleges and university was when people went to college, not only did they learn other subjects, but they also learned the professional trades. He's known for his speech, The Atlanta Compromise, and he was the founder of the Negro Business League. So if you think of the Urban League today, right, the Urban League has its foundation in Booker T. Washington's Negro Business League. So I have two books for you. One book is kind of a middle school age book, Who Was Booker T. Washington? And then the other book here is a book that was directly written on Booker T. Washington. If you want to read his autobiography is entitled Up From Slavery. Now, why is Booker T. Washington so important to the city of Norfolk? Some of y'all probably have already guessed. I'm going to give you some of the history behind it. All right, now last night when I was doing this research, this is probably was the most intriguing facts that I found all year. And the reason that I say that is because most people probably do not know how Booker T. Washington High School was developed and how it formed. So the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church founded the Norfolk Mission College for Negro students in 1883. All right, the second graduating class was in 1889. This is the second graduating class of the Norfolk Mission College. At that time, the city had a policy which stipulated that no more than 2 children from any one family of any race could attend public school. Mission College offered high school level courses which was not previously offered to Negro students. The Norfolk Mission College was a privately funded school for African American students in Norfolk, Virginia area. The school was established by the United Presbyterians and the first class started in 1883. Norfolk Mission College taught thousands of students at various levels of education and provided for students who could not afford the 50-cent tuition. The school lasted until 1916, then was sold to the city of Norfolk. Now, there are two other developments that comes out of the Norfolk Mission School, and one would be the first African American library here in Norfolk. All right, so the city of Norfolk granted the building of the first public high school for African American students, which was Norfolk Mission College. When the city bought the building of Norfolk Mission College, they renamed it Booker T. Washington High School. All students from 1916 to 1922 in the city of Norfolk County and the surrounding areas attended Booker T. Washington High School. But the question is, what happened after 1922? Now, we always ride past the Blyden Library and probably really never thought about, why is it named Blyden? Even myself, I've been going to the library for, I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but it's a couple of decades, and it never really dawned on me, hey, this library is named after Edward Blyden. You cannot study African history, African American history, Pan-African history, especially of the late 19th century coming into the early 20th century without studying Edward Woodman Blyden. He was a fantastic man, and he did a lot. He was actually the first president of the College of Liberia. And guess what? I just talked to his great-great niece maybe about 2 weeks ago, and I forgot a book, right? And I can't think of the title right now, but his descendants are still living. So the Blyden branch opened July 19th, 1921 in the single room of the original Booker T. Washington High School on Princess Anne Road. That is still the building of Norfolk Mission College. So when it changed over from Norfolk Mission College to Booker T. Washington High School, the first African American library, which is the one now on East Princess Anne Road, started in one room inside of the first Booker T. Washington High School. So the library provided services for the city to approximately 43,000 African American residents and was the first library for African Americans supported by a municipality in Virginia. Blyden branch moved to Johnson Avenue and Church Street in 1938, and it is currently located at 879 East Princess Anne. So your library is actually named after a very great man, Edward Blyden. So now it brings us back to what happened after 1922. So I actually found these pictures online. So let me see if I have, did I put it up here? No, I did not. All right, so basically from 1922 until 1974, this is the Booker T. Washington High School that the majority of the residents attended, right? This is during the time in which, living in the South, the schools were segregated, meaning that black students and white students all had to go to separate schools. Then, if you think about Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which said that separate but equal is not constitutional, at that time, most of the cities around the country had to come up with a desegregation plan. Norfolk was part of a desegregation plan that was created throughout the state of Virginia. Now, there was a lot of resistance, but in the end, the schools eventually had to integrate. Because they had to integrate and the population of Norfolk also grew, they had to build new high schools. So this is how you get to the high school now, Booker T. Washington High School, which most of you all, or a lot of you all, probably attend. There was another high school, which I don't quite have all of the information on it yet, but it was called John T. West High School. It was actually founded in 1903. All right, but I got to get more information on John T. West High School. But this is why Booker T. Washington, the man, is how his legacy lives here in the state of Virginia and particularly in Norfolk. So let's go down Bramerton and Corprew, right? So across the street from Norfolk State University, you have the Phyllis Wheatley. The Phyllis Wheatley today is a dormitory, but originally Phyllis Wheatley was one of the first YWCAs for women in the city of Norfolk. The YWCA, this YWCA was the sister YWCA of the one that is located off of Tidewater Drive and around Huntington. So this particular building is the only building and the only structure of architecture in the city of Norfolk. So this is a very historical building. But more than that, it's named after the colonial poet Phyllis Wheatley. Now, when I was growing up, my grandfather and I, we used to sell the New Journal and Guide. It's the New Journal and Guide now, but at that time it was called the Norfolk Journal and Guide. Some of you all may have relatives or you may have attended P.B. Young Senior Elementary School. Also, you may have visited or lived in Young's Terrace or Young's Park. All right? This is the name of the man P.B. Young. P.B. Young was the owner of the Norfolk General and Guide newspaper, also known as the Journal and Guide newspaper, in which he bought. He was taught to be an apprentice by his father. He moved from North Carolina, came here to Norfolk, and eventually at a very young age, he was able to get enough money to buy the newspaper. The Norfolk Journal and Guide was one of the major African-American newspapers, such as the Afro-American newspaper or the Defender newspaper. He won an award from the Negro Publishers Association, and he also founded the Norfolk branch of the NAACP, founded September 17, 1917. So if you've ever heard the song Lift Every Voice and Sing by James Weldon Johnson, James Weldon Johnson during that time was the field secretary, and he actually came here to Norfolk to give them their charter for that branch of the NAACP. Now, one thing about Mr. Young is that he was very concerned about the housing conditions here in Norfolk. So he was an advocate. He was an advocate of improving the housing conditions and education throughout the city. So, as you can see, this concludes my presentation. So, if you don't know why you are important, if you don't know why you should have pride in who you are and your community, if you don't know how Booker T. Washington High School was formed and any other history, believe it or not, a lot of this history is on the Norfolk City Public Library website. I want you to go there, learn about your community, and take pride in your community.